So we've got a few kind of like philosophical questions tonight. The first one is, and you'll see why we want to talk about this, can God create a rock that he can't lift? Does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? Is there anything that God finds difficult to do? And if God has decided to do something, can we change his mind? Okay, let's start with the first one. Can God create a rock that he can't lift? Well, this is a real hoary chestnut, this one. It's a philosophical paradox. You know, we used to, when we were kids, they used to sort of ask this question to prove, you know, that it was, I don't know what it proved, but it was one of those mind benders you couldn't get your head around, because if God can create a rock that he can't lift, then why can't he lift it? And if he can lift it, then how can it be? How does it work? If it can God create a rock that he can't lift? Well, he must be able to create a rock that he can't lift. But if he can't lift it, then he's not God. That's kind of like the way it works. Okay.
Is the rock a metaphor for something?
Pardon?
The rock is a metaphor for something.
Well, let's wait and see. But anyway, there are two different ways of framing this kind of question. The first is the examples which relate to creation. So, for example, here are some of the sorts of questions which ask. Can God cause a person to travel both north and south at the same time? Can he make a person board the train and remain on the platform at the same time? Can he win a chess match in one move while following the rules of the game? Can God make 2 and 2 equal 5? Can he fit an elephant through the eye of a needle without expanding the eye or shrinking the elephant? They're all similar kinds of questions, and they're all examples which relate to creation. And then there are examples which relate to God. So can God replicate himself and still be one? Can he limit himself? Can he limit himself and still be infinite? Can he make himself unable to do something and still be omnipotent? In other words, can he create a rock that he can't lift? So actually, these mind benders seem to have very little relevance to us other than just being nice philosophical kind of mind twisters. And we have to ask, well, what's it doing in this course? But we'll see that it actually does have some sometimes quite profound implications for us as well. So let's start by seeing how these questions would have been dealt with by the various groups of sages, the various schools of thought, starting with the Jewish philosophers from the Middle Ages, who were by and large rationalists. And they concluded that God's omnipotence means that he can do anything that is physically impossible. In other words, he can split seas, he can cause bread to fall from the sky, he can create something from nothing, he can resurrect the dead. All of these are things which are physically impossible, and he can do those things, but he can't do things which are logically impossible. In other words, 2 and 2 can't equal 5. It has to equal 4. That's logic. And similarly, a person can't simultaneously be riding a horse and not riding a horse. An elephant can't pass through the eye of a needle unless one of two things happen. The element shrinks or the eye of the needle grows. Okay, so they're logical impossibilities, and God doesn't do that kind of stuff. That's where they were coming from. Maimonides is the person who best represents this school of thought, and we'll see on page 142 in text number 1, he's thinking about this. And he says, and this is in the Guide for the Perplexed, the inability to accomplish something that is beyond one's sphere does not constitute imperfection. We would not call someone weak if they were unable to lift 1,000 talents. A talent was an ancient weight. It was approximately 60 pounds, so 1,000 talents is 30 tons or 27,000 kilograms, something like that. So you wouldn't call a person weak if they couldn't lift 30 tons. And so too, we do not consider God to be imperfect because he can't transform himself into a body. Yeah. So Maimonides doesn't mean to say to us over here that a human being lifting 27,000 kilograms is inherently contradictory. What he's saying is we just don't call such a person weak, yeah? Because you can't do that, okay? For not being able to lift up such a huge amount. In the same way, he wants to suggest that we don't say God is lacking in any way for not being able to do anything which is beyond the divine sphere of possibility within a logical world. So when we say so-and-so is strong, we don't mean that he can lift the Empire State Building. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. And his inability to do that doesn't make him weak. And similarly, the word omnipotent doesn't apply when we're talking about something which God can't do that is clearly just ridiculous. Yeah. You don't say God is not omnipotent because he can't replicate himself or because he can't make 2 and 2 equal 5. That's where these philosophers are coming from. So the rationalist approach is that assumes that everything about God must make sense to our rational minds. Our logic is what helps us understand what is possible and what is not possible. And if a feat is logically or mathematically impossible, God can't be faulted for not being able to do that. The Jewish mystics disagreed with this line of thinking, okay? And they said that while the rationalists thought that existence is hemmed in by what is possible, the mystics argued that this puts a huge limitation on God, and it confines God to that which is possible, and you can't confine God. So their position is put in text number 2 on page 143. And it's from one of the great sages called the Rashba, Reb Shlomo ben Aderet, who says, it is clear that the beliefs that we have that are rooted in our tradition and those that are sourced in prophetic revelation cannot be falsified by logic. The truth is, no one would deny a truth that is accepted on faith unless he was of those who deny the possibility of anything that is naturally or physically impossible, those who say that the impossible is impossible even for God. It is as if they assert that nothing, and this is the key words, I know it's slightly dense, but it is as if they assert that nothing transcends their own logic. But the truth is that the transcendent God oversees natural law, and he can, and he does, on occasion, change it, for he is the master to preserve it or to change it. So he's coming from somewhere else entirely. The mystics argue that it was God who created logic, and he is the architect of all constraints and not its prisoner. The rationalist says it's impossible for God to make a rock that God can't lift. The mystic says God is not constrained by human logic. He can not only do the impossible, he can also do the unthinkable. Just because we are constrained by logic and can't get our heads around it, doesn't mean that it's not possible for God. God doesn't operate within our logical, constrained world. And then comes the Hasidic masters as a third school. And they, in the first instance, side with the mystics, that just because something is impossible for a finite human being to conceive, doesn't make it impossible for God to conceive it. However, Chassidut doesn't deny the rationalist position either. And we need to understand where they're coming from. So they argue God chose to create the world that operates within certain kinds of logical constraints. And God enters into this world and operates within that framework of logical constraints. He confines himself to the constraints. It's a kind of like a self-imposed restraint. And the philosophers are correct to say that God therefore can't make a rock which he can't lift. Here's an example, just because I can see eyes already beginning to kind of dull. Okay. Now, supposing a parent invents a fun board game to play with their children, and along with the physical game and all the pieces, etc., the parent also creates some rules for the game. And now imagine that the parent now sits down and plays the game with his children. Is he constrained, he or she, constrained by or limited by the rules that they have created?
Well, again, it's self-imposed, but they've made up.
It's self-imposed, they've made it up. So on the one hand, it's preposterous to say that they are constrained by it because, as Andy has said, they made it up. On the other hand, the parent is, they could very well have made up another set of rules, but the parent decided that, for example, that the game pieces can only be moved horizontally and only when a purple card is drawn. Okay, that's the rule they made up. And they could just have easily have decided that the pieces move only vertically and that only when a rectangular card is drawn. Okay. But now they've decided that the rules work this way because they've chosen to play the game with their children. They are constrained by the completely random rules that they invented. Okay. And it's something of a similar nature to God. He could theoretically have created or done anything. But having created the world with a certain kind of framework and logic, so that 2 and 2 in our world equals 4, and having entered into this world to act within this world, he is going to be constrained by the rules that he created. Okay, that's the position that Chassidut takes. And that's expressed in text number 3 on page 144 from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. All the rules of logic were created by God. It follows that he who created these rules is not constrained by them. As Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet wrote in his well-known responsum, the one that we've just read before, it is impossible for anything to be impossible for God. When certain Jewish philosophers claimed that some impossibilities are impossible even for God, they were referring to God as he chooses to confine himself to the rules of logic. Okay. Well, there was one very famous, tangible example of the way in which a logical impossibility could exist within creation.
I was just thinking about.
And what was it?
We're parting of the Red Sea?
No.
No.
It was the ark. The ark which stood in the Holy of Holies, which contained the 10 Commandments. Okay. The length of the ark was 2.5 cubits. Those measurements are given to us in the Torah itself. Okay. We know there was 2.5 cubits. The cubit is approximately somewhere between 2 and 4 feet. Okay. And it sat in the Holy of Holies, which once again were given the dimensions in the Torah, which is 20 cubits in width. So you've got 20 cubits, and within that, you've got 2.5 cubits sitting right in the middle. Now, here was the thing. If you measured from this edge of the ark to the end of the Holy of Holies, it was 10 cubits. If you measured from this end of the ark to the end of the Holy of Holies, it was 10 cubits. And yet, you had the ark sitting in the middle, and it was 2.5 cubits. And that is a logical impossibility in our world. It didn't occupy space, and yet it did occupy space. So here you see an example of the way in which God, if he chooses, can defy even that which is logically impossible.
So Rabbi, would that be the?
Speak a bit louder so people can hear you
Sorry, would
online.
that be the Hasidic view or the mystic view?
No, that is not neither Hasidic nor a mystic view. That is Talmudic fact.
Right, but would it be consistent with?
Would be consistent with the Hasidic view.
Okay. Got
Yeah,
it.
yes, yeah. That God can, well, no, actually, it's not consistent with the Hasidic view, because the Hasidic view says that once God comes into the world, he plays by the rules. Here you have something which was higher, came into the world, and didn't play by the rules. So it's almost like the mystic view over here. He was able to create the impossible within the constraints of our world.
But why wouldn't the parting of the Red Sea also be an example?
That was just a miracle. But I think we'll come to that. Now, Andy, you were very sharp right at the very outset when I said this idea of can God create a rock that he can't lift is metaphoric, because there is one sense in which it actually does apply to all of us. There is a sense in which there is a rock in this world that God can't lift. Because every creature in the universe is under God's control. The sun, the gnat, quantum physics, nuclear physics, every element, every motion, every cause, every effect, all of that is controlled and determined by God. None of them are too heavy for him to lift, so to speak. He can change any of those if he wishes to. The one exception to this rule is us, humans, because we actually, in a sense, control our own destinies because we were endowed with free will. And God therefore chose to create a wild card in creation that has the ability to defy his will. He actually chose to make himself powerless, or in a sense incapable of controlling, of lifting, so to speak, this particular entity called the human being. In simple words, God created us, but he can't lift us. He can't change us. We have to lift ourselves. And that's the crunch point of this whole exercise. To recognize that, at least in metaphoric terms, there's this one element in the whole of creation in which God took his hands off and said, over to you. I'm not going to interfere with you. You make the decisions in your life. I might speak to you, try to give you guidance. Ultimately, it's your show. You're going to make of your life whatever you think you're going to make of it.
That's very tough.
And I'm not going to interfere. This is one rock I can't lift.
What a responsibility.
Pardon?
What a responsibility.
It's a heck of a responsibility. It suddenly takes this whole philosophical debate and puts it in very powerful personal terms. Yes, there is an entity in this world, one thing which is, so to speak, impossible because God chose it that way. Could he theoretically interfere in our lives and direct us, like put a bit in our mouths with reins and direct us like he directed a horse? Of course he could, but he chose not to. And therefore we can stray wherever we want. And we do. That's the reality.
So what would the reason for that be?
Because we had to make God created a world in which we have to find him, not him find us. And there's that lovely story that on one occasion, the Baal Shem Tov, the great Baal Shem Tov, was traveling in his coach with his disciples on one of his missions, and they came across a little boy crying at the side of the road. And they stopped the coach and they comforted him and asked him what was wrong. And he said, well, he was playing a game of hide and seek with his friends. And he was the one who had to hide. And he hid so well that his friends couldn't find him, and they gave up, and they've gone home. And he's left all by himself and he's crying. And so they comforted him, they gave him a sweet or whatever it was, and got back in the coach. And then the disciples said to the Baal Shem Tov, Master, you have always taught us that everything that we see or experience in this world has a lesson to teach us in divine service. What is it that we can learn from this experience? And he said, this is what King David said in the book of Psalms when he declared, Achen ata kel mistateh. Oh, but you are a God who hides himself. So he said, God has played a game of hide and seek with humanity. And he's hidden himself really, really well. And he's hidden himself so well that we have stopped looking for him. We've gone home to do other things. And maybe the Almighty sheds a little tear as well, that we stopped looking. Because this was the rock that he created in such a way that he was not going to lift it. That's the end of our first question tonight.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ask a question, but ask it loudly so
Yes,
people who are online can hear us.
Okay, I have a loud voice. It's not really that he can't lift it, it's that he's decided he's not going to.
Yes, it's not that he can't, he's decided that he won't. Yes, exactly so. Right, let's come to our next question. So the answer to our first question is that there's nothing that is impossible for God, even that which is logically impossible. Yet as God operates the logical universe that he created, he chooses to confine himself to the constraints of logic. That's more or less the way in which we have resolved this question. Would you mind just pouring me some water as well, because coffee always makes you very thirsty. Yeah. Does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? What would you like to answer to this question as we begin? Onliners, what do you think? Thank you very much. You're muted, so we can't hear you. I think you're muted, so we're not.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Does God's foreknowledge preclude our free choice? What do you think? Yes or no?
That's an age-old question, isn't it?
I really have no idea.
No answer. Okay. Well, let's see if we can find an answer. So the principle of free choice is enshrined in the Torah as a central principle of Judaism. In the words of Moses, spoken to the entire nation of Israel shortly before his passing, he says the following in text number 4 on page 146. And he says, from the book of Deuteronomy, see, I set before you today life and good and death and evil. I call upon the heaven and the earth to serve as witnesses that I have informed you of this. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life. And that is where we see that choice is enshrined in the Torah itself. And this therefore raises a very important question, because if we believe that God has foreknowledge of events, if he knows our choices before we make them, do we have free choice? Or are all of our choices prescripted because he knows about them already? That's the conundrum. And by the way, this topic has been discussed for centuries, and many, many different approaches have been formulated. And we're just going to offer one very simple way of looking at that tonight. So Rabbi Elmos Nino, who was one of the commentaries on the Ethics of the Fathers, in text number 5 on page 147, puts it like this. Supposing I see Reuven running. While he is certainly running, his running isn't compelled by my knowledge and observation of his running. I'm not making him run, he's running, and I can see that he's running. Although my knowledge of his running is absolute, his running is by his choice. And the same applies to divine knowledge. God's foreknowledge of our choices doesn't compel our choices because God transcends time and our future is his present. And just as our knowledge of current events doesn't compel those events, so does his knowledge of our future choices not compel our choices. Or put very simply, knowledge of a choice doesn't necessarily compel the choice. And there's a very, very nice little exercise over here, which we're not going to look at inside, but I just read you something. It's the game called Husbands and Wives. Okay, Husbands and Wives game is played as follows. You put to one spouse a scenario, and because they've been married to the other person for a very long time and know exactly how they're going to react, you ask them, how do you think they are going to respond to this particular scenario? So here are some of the scenarios that we've offered us over here. I don't believe it's in your workbook, so I have it here. The two of you are driving to an event and you're running a bit late. You're a bit anxious and you're going 15, 20 miles per hour over the speed limit. How will your wife react? Okay, you know exactly how she's going to react, don't you? Okay. Your mother calls and says she wants to visit for a week. How will your wife react? Your wife gets, something's a bit, yeah. You take your wife out for ice cream. Or you take your husband out for ice cream. What flavor is he or she going to choose? I mean, we know the answers about our spouses, don't we? Yeah. Knowing the answer, does that mean that you have forced them to make that choice? You just have knowledge of what they're going to choose, but you haven't forced them to choose. You haven't taken away their choice. Just, you know them so well. You know what they're going to decide.
So how about your knowledge of that? That doesn't stop them making a different choice once in a while.
No, it can make a different choice. Here's some questions for the wife, the other way around, okay? You come home from work and tell your husband that your boss was rude to you. How will he react and what will he advise you to do? Well, we all know the answer to that. He wasn't listening. He heard nothing. Sorry, what did you say, darling? You're taking a walk with your husband and you see an emergency unfolding in front of you. What will your husband do? Will he call 999? Will he run to help? Will he pull out his phone and start videoing? Just stand and watch, run away, or anything else? Now, here's a great one, okay? You send your husband grocery shopping and you give him a list of items to buy. What will he come home with? A, everything on the list. B, everything on the list plus a few other things that caught his eye. C, he'll miss out getting a few things on the list. D, he'll come home with a few items that he's not sure exactly how they got into the shopping cart. Okay. The point about all of these is, again, just because a person knows exactly how a person reacts doesn't mean that they cause them to act in that way. And here's another example. Imagine that you have invented a time machine and you visited the future. And you then return to the present and you foretold the future. Did you know the future because it was preordained? Or does your knowledge result from having simply observed those events? And this is what our rabbi in this quotation does in exactly the same way. He argues that God, who is timeless, for him the future is like our present, is like the present. He doesn't know what we'll choose because he's predetermined our choice. He knows what we would choose because he sees what we will choose. Are you comfortable with this? Simon, you're looking a little puzzled.
He sees intuitively.
No, like he sees his future now. There's no present and future for God. There's present and future for us. But you can't say God's now and then, you know, and there's no future for him. God is the past, the present, and the future all in one. He's beyond time. Time is a construct that is created. It's our world that we have a past, a present, and a future. For the transcendent God, there's no past, present, and future. So our future is already something which he knows, but not one necessarily which he has preordained. That's the answer that we're giving here tonight. By the way, I just want to tell you that although we have a perception that we have absolute free choice in all areas, our perception is faulty because we don't. And I'll give you some examples. We don't have any choice over our parents, who our parents are. You choose your parents. We don't have any choice over the circumstances in which we were brought up. The home, the country, the environment, the wealth or the lack of wealth, the struggles, the absence of struggles. All of those are givens in our lives. We didn't choose those things. And there are many events which happen in our lives over which we have no choice whatsoever, as we all know. So actually, the Torah says that in the majority of our lives, there is no free choice. And the only area in which there's free choice is in regard to the moral choices that we make. That is where free choice actually applies. Now, that's a big area because that's the one which dictates many of the choices in our lives. But it's not absolute. I just put that in as in brackets. But the answer to our second question is, and the way in which we've tried to frame it tonight, is that God's foreknowledge of what we do isn't the cause of our choice, it is the outcome of our choice. Can you live with that?
Sorry, can you
Say
say that
that
again?
again? Yeah.
The answer, so God's foreknowledge of what we do isn't the cause of our choice. It is the outcome of our choice. He didn't make us make that choice. We made the choice. He just knows what the choice was. Question. Online?
No, I was going to say he's not the cause of the choice.
Yes.
He just knows what the choice will be.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what we're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So can I just ask a
Ask,
question
yeah.
about,
Andy,
Um,
question coming up here.
you said the only, the moral choices are the ones that we have.
Moral choices where we have free choice, yes.
Because we obviously can't, choose,
Because there's lots of other things we can't choose, yeah.
So why only the moral choice? Because there's a lot of other choices.
Well, when we say moral, I'm using it in a very, very broad sense.
Right.
But the ability to choose right or to be good or to be bad, to be righteous or to be evil, to choose the right thing or to choose the wrong thing, etc., to make choices to create a better world or to destroy the world, all of that is within the purview of our moral choices.
So really all the choices we make once we're,
In our lives,
able enough to
all the choices we
Okay.
make in our lives, yes, yes.
But what about like our choice of occupation or going on vacation or, all those little things? Those aren't moral.
So what about choices such as going on vacation or what are the jobs that we choose, etc.? I believe that those are our free choices. In the broader sense, they also impact upon, they also come under the umbrella of the moral choices that we make. You can choose to do a form of work which has absolutely no benefit to mankind whatsoever. Or you could choose, as Michael did, for example, who's online with us tonight, to be a doctor and to spend your life saving other people's lives and to do very high and noble things. Those are choices which we make. Now, it may well be that there are certain circumstances which directed you towards those choices. If, for example, your father is a doctor and you've grown up in a medical home or your mother's a doctor, and you've already been pickled in medicine, etc., it's more likely. So those are some of the choices some of the elements of which you had no choice. That was the given. But once you have made the choice that you're going to follow a particular path, that then becomes your choice.
But following on from last week, we don't choose to be Jewish.
And we don't choose to be Jewish either. Correct.
Hmm.
That is a given. Yes.
Supposing somebody makes a choice which is not what God thought it would be.
Yes.
What
Well,
happens?
there's no such thing he didn't think. It's not what God, there's no such thing that God, a choice that was not what God thought it would be, because God will, with his perfect knowledge, will know whatever choice you have made, Michael.
Right.
Our third question tonight, is there anything that God finds difficult to do? Well, putting up with us for one thing.
That's a big one.
That's right. So the creation account stresses that God spoke the various acts of creation, bringing the universe into being. And God said, let there be a light. And God said, etc. 10 times it says that. Question is, why do we use the expression of speech to describe creation? We could have said God made light, could have said God caused the earth to sprout vegetation. So why is the speech the metaphor? And the answer is because, as the Medrash points out in Psalms, that the speech is something which is absolutely relatively effortless. So to say that God created the entire universe through speech means in the same way that I'm speaking now and could speak possibly for a very long time, as I have been known to do in any event, particularly at sermon slots. It comes with relatively little effort. So the creation of this huge, vast universe was not a difficult task for God. That's our starting point. So we have this text in number 6 on page 149, which simply emphasizes this point that speaking is effortless. I won't read it out, it's there for you. But for God, the creation of the world was effortless. So human beings have some things that we can do. There's some things that we can't do. And there's some things which we can do, but with difficulty. Okay? For God, who is infinite and omnipotent, the concept, and for whom the concept of impossible doesn't exist, as we've already discussed, the concept of doing something which is difficult or challenging simply can't apply to God. So in one sense, you can't say that something is difficult for God. Nevertheless, on a number of occasions, what are you pointing to over there? What have we got there?
The next thing, she talked about the Red Sea.
The Red Sea, yes. Nevertheless, on a number of occasions, our sages do use the term difficult in relation to what God does. And quite right, Simon, in text 7a, on page 150, we read as follows. Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, it is as difficult for God to make a shidduch, to match two human beings together as it was for him to split the Red Sea. Okay, which, by the way, implies, first of all, that splitting of the Red Sea was difficult, and that matching people together is also difficult, and it was as difficult as the splitting of the Red Sea. We've just said that nothing is difficult for God. And yet our text over here, taken from the Talmud, has said, oh, the splitting of the Red Sea was hard, and making a shidduch that's plenty hard. So we have a contradiction. And we have another text. Pardon?
It's as difficult.
As difficult.
What that could really mean is that it's not, neither is difficult.
Well, we're going to see that they were both difficult. Text number 7b on page 200, and also page 150. Providing a person's livelihood is as difficult for God as the splitting of the Red Sea. For it says he provides food to all flesh, And in the next verse, it says, to him who divided the Red Sea in parts. The implication over here is that splitting of the Red Sea was something which was difficult for God. So in what sense was providing a livelihood or making a shidduch difficult for God? And in what sense was splitting the Red Sea difficult for God? Because these are being compared to him. So the Zohar, which of course is the fundamental Kabbalistic work, addresses this question. And we'll see that in text number text number 8 on page 152, where it says as follows, taken from the Zohar. When God wishes to do something, all before him is as naught, and nothing can stand in his way. Yet you say that the splitting of the sea was difficult. Well, when God desired to split the sea for the Jewish people, Rachav, the archangel of Egypt, protested before God. Master of the universe, why do you exact justice upon the Egyptians, but split the sea for the Jews? They're all guilty before you. They both serve idols. They've both committed sexual wrongs. They've both committed murder. Aren't your ways just and true? At that moment, it was difficult for God to override his sense of justice. Now, what is happening in this passage from the Zohar? Well, God interacts with the world in two modes. First, there is midat hadin, the attribute of justice. And when God operates through midat hadin, he is very exact and is very particular. Human misdeeds require appropriate consequences. So when somebody, instead of fulfilling the purpose for which they were created, instead a person opts for a selfish path or denies God or hurts others, then midat hadin steps in and says, according to all the laws of strict justice, this person has lost their right to live. Would any employer retain an employee who ignores the boss? Or somebody who plays computer games instead of working, or disturbs all of the others in the office and stops them from doing their job? If you're not doing your job in the world, get out. It's not a place for you. That's midat hadin. That is the way in which the world is judged strictly. But on the other side, there is midat harachamim. Midat harachamim means the divine attribute of mercy. And midat harachamim sees things through different spectacles. When God operates in this mode, he is merciful and is forgiving, in the same way that a parent forgives the misdeeds of a child, God forgives the misdeeds of his children. And then we're given a second chance. Now, the problem with the splitting of the Red Sea was a time when God...
Not as good as last week.
You see, that's another.
Michael, you just need to mute, please.
Sorry?
Yeah,
You need to mute.
because there was a noise, yeah,
We can hear you, so you just need to mute. Okay.
yes.
So the splitting of the Red Sea was an instance in which God chose to interact with the world via midat hadin. Rather than forgiving the Egyptians, which he had done for a very long time, he chose to revoke the gift of life from them. But at the same time, the problem was there were also some Jews who were also very undeserving. And the Talmud describes, and we saw in the Zohar over here, there were some Jews who carried idols with them out of Egypt. And incredibly, they crossed the sea holding on to their idols. It's hard to believe. Crazy, yeah. And as we see over here, they were all guilty of sexual wrongs. They both committed murders. They were Jews who were completely undeserving of life. Midat hadin is in the ascendancy. Midat hadin is now flashing bright. Midat hadin is operating right now. And if midat hadin is going to operate, then anybody who falls into that category, whether you're Egyptian or Jew, you're all in exactly the same boat. So you should all perish. And this is what was difficult for God, because he chose to apply Midat Hadin to the Egyptians, and instead of applying Midat Hadin to the Jews, he applied at the same time Midat HaRachamim. And this is problematic because it's not fair and it's not deserving either. That is what the sages mean when they say that the splitting of the Red Sea was difficult. It was an out of the ordinary feature in which two completely dueling, contradictory forces were applied simultaneously.
And with married couple.
Pardon?
with-
We're coming to married couples. Okay. Now you have to ask the question, was this really difficult for God? I mean, is this like going down to a kiddush and denying yourself a salt beef on rice sandwich and the cholent? I mean, that's difficult. Okay. But even this clash of midot, of attributes, is that really difficult for God? Of course, it's not difficult per se. But when we use the term difficult for God, we mean it in a sense in which there is something unusual going on, out of the ordinary going on in creation. We'll see this described by the Lubavitcher Rebbe in text number 9 on page 154.
You doing some more water?
I'm fine for the moment, thank you. Sorry, it's not from one of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbes. Why is splitting the sea considered difficult for God? At the splitting of the sea, there was a revelation of God's infinity and transcendence that permitted the finite system of creation and that permeated the finite system of creation and caused a change in the laws of nature. This is, so to speak, difficult, not because it is difficult in the literal sense for God to accomplish this. After all, God created nature, and it is certainly not difficult for him to institute changes in the system that he created, but it is difficult in the sense that it constitutes a change from the default that God had set in place. For God to express himself in a finite fashion within the sphere of finite creation is not difficult. For God to express himself in an infinite fashion is also not difficult. However, for God to express and reveal his infinite energy within the finite world, that is, so to speak, difficult. As explained, at the splitting of the sea, there was a revelation of God's infinity and transcendence that permeated the finite system of creation to the point that the laws of nature were suspended and the sea transformed into dry land. And moreover, the entire concept of the event was the revelation of the infinite light of God that was patently revealed here in this world. Infinite is one thing, finite is another thing. The infinite God is in one sphere, the finite world is another sphere. How does the infinite express itself within the finite? Is a contradiction in terms. Whenever something of that nature happens, we term it difficult. So if now the splitting of the sea was difficult, in what sense is bringing a man and a woman together in a union difficult? Okay. In the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy explains it beautifully. Text number 10 on page 155. It is a tremendous feat to split an entity that is intrinsically one, such as a sea, into two distinct parts. It is a similarly spectacular feat to join two entities that are in essence distinct. Just as sea splitting sunders something indivisibly singular, so it is equally challenging to create a unified entity out of entities that are essentially distinct, such as a man and woman. And this pairing and uniting requires supernatural input. Let me explain. The point that the Maharal of Prague is making over here is not about physics, but about metaphysics. Okay? On the physical plane, it's not difficult for us to envisage water splitting. But on a metaphysical level, the Red Sea was a single, indivisible entity. And this expressed itself in the physical reality of being one single body of water. Dividing the water ran contrary to the sea's spiritual identity, which is to be one single entity. And this requires a burst of divine energy that is beyond the normal day-to-day operation. Okay? It required a revelation of infinite light. Conversely, joining two separate entities should result in a double entity. 1 + 1 equals 2. And yet the amazing thing is that every time a couple get married, 1 + 1 equals 1. Because each person, every human being, is a universe on their own, in their own world. And two universes can't ever become one, seemingly. In fact, the way in which God created us encourages us to remain individualists, to remain incompatible. People are not primed to surrender their individualism. And you can't have a successful relationship unless you give up something of your essence. And all of us who are married will understand this. We cede some of ourselves in order to be able to unite with another human being. A person who doesn't marry very often doesn't marry because they're not prepared to make that kind of commitment. Somebody else is permitted to come and to occupy your space. And the truth of the matter is that it's darn inconvenient in many respects. It limits my individuality. It limits my freedoms. It constrains me in terms of what I can do. It takes away many of my own choices for what I might want to do in my life. And therefore, the notion that two human beings could ever truly unite and connect is wondrous. It's illogical. It's actually not the way in which we were made. And yet, there is this profound driving force throughout the whole of humanity, from the very moment that human beings were created, that we seek to cleave to another human being and to unite with them. And that once we have come together in that relationship, it's not 1 and 1, 1 + 1 = 2. Miraculously, it is 1 + 1 that becomes an incredible, sublime unity. It becomes a new one. And it's a higher one and a bigger one than the individual ones.
Unless, of course, the Red Sea happens.
The Red Sea was the other way around. The Red Sea was a one that split into two. What the Maharal of Prague is saying to us, he was a very insightful man, is that the converse is that when twos, 1 and 1, joins together, this was the opposite. It became one.
That one I was meaning is if they split, if a couple split.
If the couple split, it's like the Red Sea. Yes, yes, yeah. And what the Talmud is saying to us is that as difficult as it was, difficult, inverted commas, bringing two human beings together, making a shidduch between two human beings so that they can actually come together and not kill each other in the process, is as difficult to him, for God, as splitting the Red Sea. And there's a wonderful story in the Talmud about a certain Roman woman who had learned this particular piece of Talmud, and she came to the rabbi, one of the famous rabbis in the Talmud, and said she can't understand, why it should be so difficult, and she's going to show that it's really easy. And she had a whole bunch of slaves, and she sort of lined them up and said, okay, you're going to marry this one, you're going to marry that one. So she paired them all up in the course of a night. And by the next day, there were people walking around with broken heads, with broken arms, with broken legs, bruises all over themselves. It just led to a complete incompatibility. And, it's, you learn a big lesson from magnetism. There are two polarities in magnetism. You've played with magnets, yes? A magnet can either stick together, or if you've got the negatives, they push each other apart. You just can't bring them together. And it's the same thing with human beings.
Sorry, how can the shared to be together?
If
Like referred to as
it's Beshed, what
So isn't that
does
fair?
Beshed mean? That the Almighty has brought this person to the world and brought them into a certain place and brought them in a certain part of the world, etc. And this person over here is in another part of the world altogether, and he brought them together. That's magic. And I very often, when I meet talking to couples who are about to get married, and I ask them, why they chose each other. What do they see that made them feel that they're going to spend the rest of their life together? And in some instances, there's people who have been, as is the way these days, they've had numerous relationships, physical relationships, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. And I'm saying to them, so what's different about this one?
Mhm.
How do you know this one's going to work? What's told you that this relationship is the right one, when all the others, even after an extended period of time, came to an end? And I always hear a variation of the same word. It's expressed in different ways. We clicked. Click. Now go and explain what that means. Go and explain the mystery of a click. And you can't. You can try and talk about genes and about dispositions and commonality and everything else, but none of it quite explains it in its totality. This click remains something that belongs to God. And that's what we're saying over here, that he can bring a one and a one together and they will create another one, not a two. And that's beautiful.
That's beautiful. How do you explain the 50% divorce rate? In theological terms.
In theological terms, it's actually that their neshamot were connected with each other, but they parted, and there's a whole issue over here about second marriages that I found really, really interesting over here. And a long note here in this book about second marriages, which but I can't find at the moment. But it seems the first marriage was the one that was beshert. The second marriage is not beshert, but people have choice. And even though they're beshert, things change and you talk yourself out of love. You find differences, there are stresses and strains in the family, in the relationship, and people part.
So you say only the first one is the shared.
Only the first one apparently is beshert.
Well, that's
I
very
need to-
interesting. So
yeah.
can I ask a quick question? Because every time Wes and I go to the farm, we have the same discussion, and I always have asked the rabbi. And it just reminds me.
I just can't find the note right now. When we come back next week, I will look up the note again and I will, oh, here we are. I have to look at it in greater detail. It's a bit complex. So we're going to have to park that one for the moment. Okay.
Can I just ask
Yeah.
a quick-
Question coming up.
So if your Bashert, your first marriage, passes away, is
Yes.
that the person who should be buried? And then what if you're
Who should be buried? Who should
buried with?
You know, you should be buried. These are personal choices. Just because you were Bashert doesn't mean necessarily to say you have to be buried alongside that person. You're buried, you know, life moves on and your feelings move on, and you're just buried where you think you feel you should be buried. Yeah. And by the way, this business of bringing people together is amplified by the fact that there are huge differences between men and women. As you know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and etc. So it is really quite extraordinary. So
Can I ask you one other question?
Yes.
along those lines? I
Yes.
was thinking when I was reading that about men and women. being
Yeah.
different, you could use this to defend like gay marriage, like because two men or two women together are not that different.
yes,
So, I know that's kind of.
so
like going
you want to
direction.
defend gay marriage on this basis here as well. There is no prohibition in Judaism for two men or for two women to love each other. The prohibition for men extends only to a physical relationship. But the recognition that there can be attraction and love and a beautiful relationship is not in itself prohibited. And lesbianism, as opposed to a gay, homosexuality, does not appear in the Torah at all, interestingly. Again, a whole nother topic.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's going in a different
right.
direction.
At any rate, the answer to our third question tonight is nothing is essentially difficult for God, but an act of God that simultaneously features competing divine energies. That is extraordinary, and we call that difficult. We term it difficult. Okay. Finally, if God has decided to do something, can we change his mind? Well, as we said a little bit earlier, we have free choice. And that means in areas of morality, we have the absolute freedom to choose whatever choice we want. In the words of Maimonides, you can be as righteous as Moses or as wicked as Yeravam. He was the man who split the kingdom after King Solomon's death and introduced idolatry to Israel. But what happens to us, as we mentioned before, is pretty much preordained by God. Lots of things are preordained by God in terms of things which happen to us. And the question is whether our prayers or our actions can change or avert a preordained event. Can we cause God to have a change of heart? Now you're all going to jump up straight away and say, but don't we say in the middle of the Yom Kippur davening to Shuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Ma'avir and Yom Ra, Gezerah, prayer and Tzedakah and charity and prayer and tefillah and prayer, tefillah, tzedakah, how's it go? Teshuvah, all of these things can change, etc. We'll come to that. But so far, the answer for us today is obviously no. If everything is pretty much preordained and God knows the outcomes. God knows the outcomes already in advance. Doesn't cause us to make those choices, but he knows what the outcomes are. So how can you ever change?
What about natural disasters, though? I mean, floods. Yeah.
Excellent question. I saw a lovely little story over here about two little boys. Two young boys spend their night with their grandparents. And when it came time for prayers, the younger one began shouting and praying at the top of his lungs, God, I pray for a new bicycle, and I pray for the latest version of the FIFA game on my computer. And the older brother says, why are you shouting your prayers? He says, God isn't deaf. He says, no, says his younger brother. He says, but grandma is. Sweet. we have the story of King Balak, the king of Moab, who retained the sorcerer Bilam to curse the Jewish people. And you remember very well, it's text number 11 on page 156, in which Bilam spoke in a parable and said, "Arise, Balak, and hear. Listen to me closely, son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, nor is he a mortal that he should have a change of heart. Would he say and not do? Would he speak and not fulfill?" And this seems to imply, this biblical text supports the idea that God does not change his mind. And yet there's another biblical text which seems to imply that God does change his mind. And that was at the time of the great flood in text number 12 on page 157, in which we read, "God saw the great wickedness of the humans on earth, and that their hearts, every inclination was consistently evil, and God regretted that he had made humans upon earth, and his heart was aggrieved. And God said, I will erase the humans whom I created from upon the face of the earth, from man to beast, from creeping thing to the fowl of the heavens, for I regret that I made them." In other words, I've changed my mind. So one biblical text tells us that God doesn't change his mind. Another biblical text seems to imply that God does change his mind. How do we understand this contradiction? So there's a very nice, interesting Rashi, the very first Rashi on the Torah, Rashi the commentator, who says, questions, the Torah begins, as we all know, with the story of creation. And Rashi, in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, questions this. And he says, since the Torah is a moral teaching that is supposed to the Jewish people and not a history book, why does the Torah begin with the creation of the world, which is a matter of history, not a matter of moral instruction? It's text 13a on page 158, very quickly. The Torah ought to have begun with the verse, "This month shall be to you the first month," the first commandment that is given to us in the Torah, much later on. It's the first mitzvah commanded to the people of Israel. So why does it begin with, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth"? And the answer that Rashi gives is, to quote from Psalms, "The strength of his work he related to his people to give them the inheritance of nations." What does that mean? If the nations of the world will say to Israel, "You are thieves for having conquered the land that belonged to the seven nations. You have no right to the land of Israel," Israel will reply, God created the world and he gave the land to whoever he wanted to give it to. And he wanted in the first instance to give it to the seven nations. And then he wanted to take it from them and give it to us. So it seems that God regretted giving the land of Israel to the seven Canaanite nations, and he changed his mind afterwards and decided to give the land to the Jews. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains the nature of what we mean by God changing his mind. And with this, we get the answer to our question as to whether God changes his mind. It's text number 13b on page 159. With this, Rashi explains the concept of regret as it is applied to God. It is not regret in the simple sense. It means rather that God's original desire was that first he should give the land to the Canaanites, and then afterward to take it from them and to give it to the Jews. And the same is true regarding God's regret before the flood. Once again, it is not regret in the simple sense. It means rather that God's original desire was to first create the world and then to destroy civilization with the flood. This is called regret because in actual fact, the second thought, although originally planned, leads to a different result from the first one. But it is not regret in the simple sense. What he's saying over here is as follows. God doesn't change his mind. and doesn't make mistakes. Sometimes, however, he determines that he'll do one thing first and another thing afterwards. He takes one course of action, and later on, he will change that. And he's already decided that from the beginning. It's not as if he suddenly looks back and says, oops, that was a big oops. You know, I say, what is the most spoken word in history? The most spoken word in history. I say it's oops. How many times in our lives is it oops? Yeah, yeah. Something didn't work out the way we intended it. Doesn't work that way for God. So if he changes something, it's because he had already decided in advance to change it. I'll do this first, and then I'll do that afterwards. And we term that regret, but it is not regret in the simple sense. It's a term that we give to when that happens. So he gave the land of Israel to other nations, and then he gave it to the Jewish people. First, he created a community, humanity, then he wiped them out in a flood. And even though there are some turns along the way, it is all calculated from start to finish, right from the very beginning. And nevertheless, despite there not being any deviation from the original plan, the Torah refers to these sorts of developments as regret, as we saw in the Chumash, and changing his mind, because practically there was one decision and then there was another. Okay? But-
Can you say that in a different way? 'Cause I don't think
Yeah,
I'm getting
I
it.
find that quite difficult to understand.
I decide that I've got a plan. I am going to tell my children, I've got a plan in my mind that I'm going to say one thing to my children about their inheritance. But in my mind now, I know that I'm going to change, I've got my plan is actually not to enact that. I'm going to enact something else afterwards. So I come to my kids and I say to them, you know, I'm going to follow the biblical command that the oldest son receives a double inheritance. Okay. But I know that I've already decided that I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to give all my children equal amounts. So some years later, I say to them, you know, I said about giving my oldest child, the oldest son was going to get double inheritance. Well, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give everybody an equal inheritance. I haven't changed my mind now. That's what I decided from the outset.
Go
I
on
just
to the
waited.
reason.
I waited. I had my own plan as to why I wanted to do it that way. Maybe I wanted them to test their acceptance of Torah law or something else, yeah, in telling them this way. But I had a plan here, and I did it in a particular order. To the outsider, it looks, to my children, it looks like I changed my mind, or that I regretted my first decision. But I didn't. In exactly the same way, God decides, I'll do this now from the outset, and I'll do that afterwards. But when the Torah describes that the change, the Torah describes it as he changed his mind or he regretted. But it wasn't a true regret because it was pre-planned that it would be this way. That was the sequence of events.
So if you apply that to the flood,
So you apply that to the flood, okay, yes.
was God ever really planning on completely destroying the world?
Yes,
Or-
from the outset. That was already part of the plan, because he had already he understood how he foresaw the outcome of people's behaviors. Remember, he knows that in advance. So he's already got it all mapped out. Because
But
for him,
he
the
saved
future,
Noah and
pardon?
The animals.
Pardon?
He saved.
Yeah,
Noah.
all of that was pre-planned. Humanity would be saved through Noah and the animals. Part of the plan. There's more to the story. When Maimonides discusses how you know whether a prophet is a true prophet or not, a false prophet or a true prophet. He provides a litmus test. And the test is this: if a prophet prophesies, foretells that something good is going to happen, it must come to pass in order for the prophet to be considered a true prophet. If that good event that he prophesied doesn't come to fruition, it is proof that he was a false prophet. His prophecy did not come to fruition. Okay? If the prophecy was about something negative, not about a good event, but about something bad that was going to happen, the failure of the prophecy to materialize does not undermine the prophet's authenticity. It is not a proof that he is a false prophet. It is only when he has prophesied something good and it doesn't come to fruition that we call him a false prophet. But if he prophesied something bad and it doesn't come to fruition, we do not, it's no proof that he is a false prophet. Why? Why?
Because maybe God changed his mind.
Because prayer and repentance can avert a divine decree. That's what we say on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's Maimonides' text is on text number 14 on page 160, I think is our last text for tonight. Prophecies of retribution. For example, if a prophet will say, so-and-so will die, in this year there will be a famine or war, and the like. If the prophecy does not come true, this does not prove that the prophet is a false prophet. Nor do we say, look, he foretold and his words were not fulfilled. And this is because God is slow to anger, abundant in kindness, and is prone to having a change of heart regarding meting out punishment. It is possible that the intended recipients of the prophecy repented and they were forgiven, as was the case with the people of Nineveh, as we read on Yom Kippur, or that retribution will be put on hold, as was the case with King Hezekiah. If, however, a prophet foretold that good would come and such will occur, and the good that was prophesied did not materialize, this is surely a false prophet. For any good that God decrees, even if the decree is provisional, will never be retracted. Isn't that great? Aren't those wonderful words from Maimonides? So you see that from the outset, God decides if there'll be a harsh decree and if later on it can be averted through prayer and repentance. But when it comes to positive prophecy, we know that if it doesn't happen, it's because the prophet was not a true prophet.
What about promises that God makes that are positive?
Will always come to fruition.
So,
And therefore all the positive prophecies in our prophets about the end of days and et cetera, all of those, it hasn't happened yet. So we can't negate the prophecies of Isaiah and of all the other great prophets, etc. And we believe that they will come to fruition. But any negative prophecy that they prophesied that didn't come to fruition did not disprove that they were prophets.
so the promise that the Jews will be like the stars in the heaven, and then the Holocaust happens, like what are you supposed to do with that?
Does it say we won't be like this? Does that mean that we won't be like the stars of the heaven?
Well,
So the question over here is, so we have a prophecy that in the Bible to Abraham that will be like the stars of the heaven or like the sands of the sea, etc. And then something like the Holocaust happens. And so how does that sit with the prophecy? And I'm asking the question, does that mean that the prophecy can't ever be, still can't be fulfilled? Because we've had albeit a horrendous bump along the road. The prophecies are not yet disproved.
Mhm.
But the point is this, that the question is, can God change his mind? And the answer to that is that in any negative matter, any matter with a potentially negative outcome, God builds into that from the outset the possibility that he will change his mind from the outset, because it's negative, because he's going to leave it to us to prevail upon him and to call out and to cry out and prayer and fasting and repentance and all the other things we have to do, the things that will avert that decree. And that is already built into the plan from the outset. He also knows the outcome, which we don't know. There's that story, it's not a very good story to end on, but it's a nice story nevertheless, about the lady who came to her rabbi, a little Jewish lady, and she said, I've been asking and asking and asking, for something from God all the time. He said, and he just doesn't answer me. And the rabbi says, he did answer you. The answer is no. Sometimes the answer is no. But look, what happens when, God forbid, a person is ill and the whole community prays, as we do, for that person to recover, and the person doesn't recover? Or somebody has a terminal illness and we're davening and davening and davening. And if you want to say that God, nothing is impossible for God, it shouldn't be impossible for him to bring that person back to good health. But for the fact that we said that God, having created the world, plays by its rules. Yeah, that's what we said about the game, remember? But the possibility that God could change his mind on a negative outcome is really, for us, a call to action. Knowing that built into the system is the possibility that he will hear our prayers means that we should do our best. So the answer over here is that although God doesn't change his mind, sometimes he determines from the outset that he will take one course of action to start with and later on another course of action. And whenever God has thought to act with justice, in other words, with midat hadin, with harshness, included in that original thought is always the possibility of changing God's mind and bringing about a kinder result. And that really is, in a nutshell, the history of the Jewish people. We've never, ever lost hope in being able to bring about good in this world. We've never lost hope of being able to turn a negative into a positive. We are an optimistic people because we believe, we understand from our texts and from our teachings that any negative outcome could already have within it the seeds of a good outcome, of a positive outcome. And it was left to us to change God's mind. And if we have failed, it means one of two things. Either it wasn't intended that this matter should become a good one, or perhaps we didn't try hard enough. Perhaps we weren't sufficiently sincere in our prayers. Perhaps we didn't change our actions in this world. Maybe we didn't pay enough attention to climate change. And so we brought it upon ourselves because we didn't act sufficiently. But it was there in the plan that we could change the world. And we chose not to. And that's quite a sobering thought. But if it is an act of kindness to us, to our families, to mankind, God doesn't change. That will definitely come about. We can't unchange it. We can change a negative to a positive. We can't ever change a positive to a negative. That's the bottom line of this particular question. Can we change God's mind?
That's a nicer thought, John.
Pardon?
That's a nicer thought.
That's a much nicer thought. Yeah.
Rabbi, I don't
Yeah.
have to address this in another class, but there just seems like it's really not fair. You
What's
know?
what is not fair?
And that's like a huge topic. Just that some people are just born with a very difficult life. but
Some
that's-
people, it's not fair that some people are born with a difficult life.
Yeah, in a short life. And other people flourish, and it's not necessarily because they're better people.
You know, I don't know whether I mentioned this. I forget sometimes what I've said and what I haven't said. You know, but in 2001, October 2001, Lindy and I went to Israel for one night to attend the wedding of the son of an Israeli couple who'd been living and been in the community for a while, with whom we've become very friendly. And that night, so we had booked into the David Citadel in Tel Aviv. And when we arrived there weren't any windows that opened, and we preferred to have fresh air. So we decided to move to the Hilton Hotel for the night, where we'd been before, where the windows do open and you can get fresh air. There's a little balcony so you can open the door. We went to the wedding and we came back, and that night I had terrible chest pain and woke up in the middle of the night with terrible, terrible pain. And Lindy called down to the hospital, to the reception, and they called the hospital doctor, and the doctor came and he wanted to assure me that I wasn't having a heart attack, but it would probably be better if I were to go to the hospital. And fortunately, because we were in the Hilton Hotel, we were very, very close to the closest A&E unit at Ichilov Hospital. And the ambulance came, and within a matter of minutes, I was transferred to the hospital, where it was confirmed exactly as the doctor knew, but didn't want to frighten me, that I was having a heart attack. Okay. And it was a terrible shock because I was completely fit. I've been on statins for many years because of, you know, family history, genetics, etc. I didn't smoke, I exercised, etc. But I said to the Russian doctor who was treating me on the table, I said, it can't be. He said, you can't fight with genes. It's genes, Ashkenazi genes. Okay. So I was put into A&E and emergency. And on either side of me, there were other patients who'd also had heart attacks. And during the course of that night, a young man on the left-hand side, the bed on my right-hand side, 50-year-old man died. And I heard his family, Sephardi man, and I heard his family wailing and screaming and his wife shouting out, "Ze lo fair, ze lo fair, it's not fair, it's not fair, it's not fair." I can still hear her words ringing in my ears. And later that night, the man on the other side of me died as well. So I wasn't a very happy bunny, okay? But I survived. And thank God I've had no problems since that date. It's now 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. So go and figure out why they died and why I lived. What do you want to say?
Well, that's easy. We couldn't do done without you, could we? At Southampton.
No, there's no, Bushy is filled with indispensable people. That's reality. All these places. No person is indispensable in this world. The answer, the world to our eyes does not appear to be a fair place. And we'll never figure it out. We're grateful for the kindnesses and for the goodnesses. And we are amongst the most fortunate. Not just the most fortunate around over here. We are in the upper percentile of the most fortunate human beings on this planet. Why were we chosen to that honor? Why were we not born into some miserable little shack in the middle of impoverished India or Africa or China or Indonesia or anywhere else you want in the world? What privilege gave us the right to be born in such extraordinary circumstances, to such loving families, to have the gift of wealth, relative wealth, to have the gift of good health, to have the gift of community, of loving marriages? Why? And some poor sod down the road, some schlemazel, gets none of it, racked with illness and poverty and difficulty. Do you want to go and read God's mind? You're left with only one of two choices. Either the world is completely and totally random and therefore is fundamentally unfair in nature's distribution of its assets, or there is a God who brings souls, everlasting souls, into bodies for periods of time and then takes them back and does whatever else has to be done with those souls. And we have no conception whatsoever. We are blind, totally blind to what the big story is and where the purpose lies. And in our lives, you have to jump one way or the other. And as we discussed last week, sometimes you jump both ways. Sometimes find yourself believing, and other times you find yourself believing less or not believing because it doesn't make sense. And then something tugs you from inside again and says, no, but there must be a purpose to this world. It can't be a meaningless world. I'm not just a more intelligent animal. It couldn't work that way. The precision of this universe, its vastness. It can't be that there's no directing hand. Nobody ever spilt ink on the table and it turned into a magnificent story. Can't happen that way. Not even over billions and billions and billions of years. It doesn't stack up. So there must be a guiding hand. And then you say, nah, can't be. And that's the struggle that we all have to live with. And somewhere within that struggle, we come across this solid fact that to our eyes, the world is not a fair place. And so you're left saying, okay, I believe that God knows what he's doing. I don't know what he's doing, but I believe that he knows what he's doing. And I'll live with that. The reason why I live with that is because it makes my life purposeful, because it gives me direction. It makes the Jewish nation purposeful. It gives us all direction. It gives humanity direction. It gives the world purpose. It answers the question, why is there creation? Why are there human beings? Why is there a world? All of those are satisfied by the belief that there is a God. And we don't understand his ways. None of that was in our text, I'm afraid.